I'm now going to teach you a few other things about triads. However, some of these will probably not be things that you will be tested over in this class. They're just things that are good for you to know. So one thing you should know about is inversions. Just like intervals have inversions, triads have inversions too. So remember I mentioned before that triads are named after the root. So this right here is an E-flat major triad. And this is what we call root position. And we call it root position because the root is on the bottom. Now, sometimes people pay a lot of attention to what's going on with the top voices, the top two notes, but actually that is not important. We could have this triad written out like that, and it would still be considered an E-flat major triad in root position. It doesn't matter that now the G is above the B-flat. What matters is the three notes that are in it are E-flat, G, and B-flat, and the E-flat is on the bottom. So although we're used to seeing triads all squished together like that, they can be written with the notes as spread out as we want, and it's still considered the same triad. And we still look at what note is on the bottom to determine the position of the triad. Now, if instead of the E-flat being on the bottom, the G is on the bottom, this is a first inversion triad. Now we call this E-flat major in first inversion. Now, what I said before applies a lot with triads, because many times my students want to say, oh, to make the inversion, you just take the bottom note and put it up on top. That's not really true, because this is also considered an E-flat major triad in first inversion. Again, what matters is the bottom note. So if the G, or the third of the triad, is on the bottom, then we call it first inversion. If the root is on the bottom, we call it root position. If the third is on the bottom, we call it first inversion. See how these are the same three notes? E-flat, G, B-flat. Here, they're just in a different order. G-flat, or G, B-flat, E-flat. It's the same three notes that we had over here, but now the G, which is the third of this triad, is on the bottom, and we call that first inversion. When the fifth is on the bottom, now it's considered second inversion. Now, in this case, we have the fifth on the bottom. Again, yes, it's true the third is on the top, but that's not the important thing because the third doesn't have to be on the top. But if the fifth is on the bottom, it's second inversion. So just to recap, when the root's on the bottom, it's root position. When the third's on the bottom, first inversion. If the fifth is on the bottom, it's second inversion. What do you think third inversion would be? That was a trick question. There's no third inversion. There are only three notes. When we learn about inversions, there's also another kind of notation that people use, especially music theorists. And this kind of notation actually dates back to much earlier times when musicians would read this kind of notation in order to play the music that was written. And this kind of notation is called figured bass. In figured bass, usually, if a chord is in root position, we don't write anything. But we could, and if we did, we would write 5-3. I'll leave you thinking about that, and I'll tell you how we would write the figured bass for first inversion. For first inversion, we would write 6-3, although frequently we just see 6 without the 3. Now, based on what I've told you about these two, I want you to take a minute and figure out what the figured bass would be for second inversion. Look at the triads and the figured bass and tell me what I should write for second inversion. Well, here, 5 refers to the distance from the bottom note to the top note, and 3 refers to the distance from the bottom note to the middle note. Here, 6 refers to the distance from the bottom note to the top note, and 3 refers to the interval from the bottom note to the middle note. So what would this one be? What's the interval from the bottom note to the top note? A sixth? And from the bottom note to the middle note? A fourth. So the origins of this are actually kind of interesting. Musicians would not always be given all of the music written out. In a way, the music they read was more like what we use today for a lead sheet. If you've ever looked at a lead sheet, if you play jazz, for example, it'll have the tune, and then it'll have chord symbols. And the musicians know how to read those, and so they improvise based on the chord progression that's listed there on their lead sheet. And a lot of sheet music you buy is like this too. It might have things like G minor 7 or whatever, and the musicians read that and know what to play. Well, at this time, people didn't really think of music in terms of chords. They thought more in terms of intervals. And what a musician would often be given, there would be one person playing a melodic instrument, maybe something like the violin, and then there would be one person playing the bass line that would be written out. And then there would be other musicians, maybe playing the lute or the harpsichord, that would just be given the bass line with chord symbols. And they would improvise based on that, because if you gave them, let's say, a C, and you wrote 6/4, they would know that with that C, they were supposed to play the note that was a fourth above the C and a sixth above the C. And that would create a triad. So today we learn the triads, and we don't focus as much, at least not until music theory class, on the figured bass. But in a way, the figured bass is where these triads come from. Now, just for fun, why don't you try to figure out what triad this is? First of all, what inversion is it? 6/4? It's the second inversion. So that means this note is going to be the root, the third, or the fifth. In second inversion, root, third, fifth. We have the fifth on the bottom. So C is actually the fifth of this chord. So if we wanted to figure out what the root was, we would go down a fifth from C, and we would know that's F. So this note right here is actually the root. If I write these notes out again with the F on the bottom, now I can figure out what triad that is. And I know my key signature for F major, so I don't have to think too hard. My key signature for F major, remember that? It was 1 flat, that was B flat. So this is F major right here, right? Because F, A, and C wouldn't have flats or sharps in the key of F major. This is an F major triad. So right here, this was an F major triad in second inversion.